This week, the Midwest board, as we've just mentioned, approved a very conditional bid for itself by the Chinese-backed Sinosteel. Now, Stephen, you have written a lot about this. What is your concern about this?
Oh, well, my only concern about the broader issue of Chinese government investments is that China is a communist totalitarian state, which isn't particularly transparent, and the idea that the Chinese government now owns more business assets in Australia than the Australian government, I think, frankly, is an important policy concern for the nation. And I would have thought that in approving these types of takeovers that the Australian government would say, well, we want to be able to do the same thing in China, that this should be a two-way street, that you know, we can't go up and buy up Chinese coal mines or invest that easily in Chinese companies, let alone launch hostile takeover bids that get approved. So my argument is simply that this should be a two-way street, and an overarching concern that at the end of the day, China is a totalitarian communist state, and there are a lot of issues about their military build-ups and human rights, Tibet, and all those sorts of issues, and therefore it's a very sensitive issue.
All right, Stephen, can I read you back something that you wrote on Crikey.com this week? You said, let's be clear about what we're facing here. The Chinese government has launched a coordinated strategy to buy up as much of Australia's strategic resources as possible. The extraordinary shopping list is before the revelation that another dozen Chinese applications are currently before the FIRB. Now, can I put to you, are you being too emotive about this? And in a sense, how is this different to the British, American and Japanese investment that we've seen in Australia, particularly in resources, over the past 1, 2, 3, 4 decades?
Well, the British, Japanese and American investments were individual companies making their own decisions. What I think you are seeing here is a coordinated strategy by a series of companies, all of which are majority controlled by the Chinese government, to basically go on a land grab to secure and lock up as many resources as possible. So just this week, the Foreign Investment Review Board approved the Puffin oil field in the Timor Sea being 60% owned by Sinopec. So that's the first time ever a Chinese government-controlled company will be the operator and controller of an Australian oil field. And we've seen a $400 million bid for the Cape Lambert iron ore project. Just recently we've seen the bid for Sinosteel. We've seen all sorts of other projects being approved, and basically the rate at which it is coming and the common ownership of the Chinese government is what makes it different from previous British, Japanese and American investments. OK, no, point taken. But can I just get straight your concern? Is it the fact that China is still a totalitarian regime? They're not as open and transparent with where they're moving and how they're going to perhaps use these stakes? Or is it just that there's not the level playing field, that our companies can't go in there and launch hostile takeover bids or any sort of a takeover bid? Well, the level playing field is an issue, but my actual overall concern is the fact that Australia should be the wealthiest country in the world. We have the greatest dowry, and we've basically mismanaged our resource assets. I mean, I was up in Brisbane last week at the Rio Tinto AGM.
That's against the Chinese, though. That's against... I mean, we've sold off far too much, I guess, is what you're saying.
Right. The fact that we only own 10% of the Northwest Shelf, that we don't own any of the Super Pit gold mine in Kalgoorlie, that we own nothing in Mount Isa anymore. My complaint is the fact that Australia has mismanaged its development of the resources dowry that it has. Whether it's Rio Tinto sitting there in London with only 2 Australian-based directors and only a 15% Australian shareholding, when they own more than $100 billion worth of Australian assets. So I'm simply saying we should be sensitive about the fact that we've already squandered so many of our resource assets previously, and we should be nervous about doing more of that, particularly this time with it being a foreign government which is actually coming in a coordinated approach. So you've got the general foreign ownership sort of disappointment about how we've performed as a nation, and then we've got the Chinese government, communism, and the fact that it's a common party in the Chinese government. That puts a new level of concern on it, as far as I'm concerned.
Scott, you're shaking your head. Do you violently disagree or not?
I don't know how you can say, Stephen, we've actively mismanaged the resources sector when the budget in a fortnight, week and a half's time, is going to show a $20 billion surplus. most of the cream coming from the resources sector.
But I guess Stephen's point is we could have had a lot more, say, if we had more than 10% of North West Shelf. But then who would be investing if it wasn't foreigners? I guess.
It's the flip side. If we've got 10%, you go, oh, why don't we have 20, why don't we have 30? It's the flip side of the coin. Like, the resources boom is the #1 reason why the Australian economy is riding out most of the shocks which are seen around the world, if you compare our economy to everywhere else.
Why do we have a $70 billion current account deficit in the middle of a resources boom? It's because tens of billions of dollars of the profits are being shipped offshore. My point is, it's fine for the government to clip the ticket for 30% of taxes from these profits, but we have a tiny equity interest in the overall Australian resources dowry. And if you look at around the world, there is resource nationalism going on. You look at what Putin is doing, you look at the South Americans, you even look at the increased taxes on the North Sea oil that Tony Blair introduced. Nations are clawing back the value from the resources boom, and I simply say that we have sold off more of ours than any other country in the world.
Yeah,
so the government should be owning the North West Shelf?
No, I don't think he meant that. But Stephen, let me ask you, how would we get that investment in being able to keep our own assets to ourselves?
Well, a very simple one would be for the Labor government to say to Rio Tinto, listen, chaps, I know you've got 4 knights and a lord on your board and you're sitting over there in London, but you actually own $100 billion worth of assets in here. We wouldn't mind if you actually came down here and was based here and had your primary listing here. And when that happened, you'd then get the Future Fund and all the other Australian funds increasing their stake in Rio Tinto, and you'd have an Australian equity interest in Rio Tinto of 30 or 40%, not 15%. It's those types of things which I think should be pursued, and you shouldn't have foreign government 100% takeovers and operations of strategic, iron ore mines. There should be joint venture plays, and there should be equity interests in partnership with local developers and investors. Not what we're seeing at the moment with the way the Chinese are doing hostile bids and trying to buy 100%.